month of March. And please pay attention to the themes as they will unfold during the weeks ahead. I'll give a little commercial at the end of this conversation. This morning, we are delighted to connect transatlantically and with very special guests and with the land of Israel as we have a conversation which is very timely. I'd like to thank Shari Levine, our executive director, and Jackie Goldstein, our communications director, for keeping us together. Jackie has been very helpful, instrumental in coordinating this program along with Devorah Greenberg. So I'd like to begin by extending special thanks to Devorah Greenberg, who is the Director of Education at the Jewish Pluralism Watch and Masoorki movement. Masoorki is the name for the conservative movement in Israel. She joins us from Israel and has helped us make the arrangements to converse with Dr. Yizhar Hess. Dr. Hess is our special guest for this program. A word about the Masoorki Foundation for Conservative Judaism. Its purpose and mission are to support the work of Israelis in building a Judaism that preserves observance and tradition while recognizing modern life in the state of Israel and opportunities for diverse expression of religious Judaism. Conservative Jews in the United States can all participate in this historic and vital enterprise through education, through exchange of ideas, advocacy, and I invite you to familiarize yourselves more with the Masoorki movement and its purposes and support it as best as you feel inclined. My pleasure now to introduce our special guest for this morning, who also joins us from Israel, Dr. Yizhar Hess, the Vice Chairman of the World Zionist Organization in the alphabet soup, WZO. Following his military service, Yizhar earned a BA in Political Science and Hebrew Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where I studied from 1967 to 1968 as a foreign student at the university. He obtained his law degree from the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya and is a member of the Israeli Bar. Dr. Hess, before he became doctor, held an MA in Jewish Studies from the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem, which is sponsored by the conservative movement, and a PhD in Sociology and Education from Sussex University in Brighton, England. Dr. Hess has professional experience in advertising and journalism. He is a regular contributor to the Israeli press. He writes on subjects of religion and state and is the co-editor of a book entitled Questions About God that was published by Ma'ariv. I'd be interested in talking with you more about that. Between 2007 and 2020, Dr. Hess served as executive director of the Masoorki movement in Israel. He has represented the movement in negotiations with the Israeli government regarding issues of egalitarian prayer at the Kotel, the wall, Western Wall, and is one of the leading voices in Israel promoting Jewish pluralism. Dr. Hess is a 10th generation Yerushalmi, Jerusalemite. He lives today in Modi'in with his wife Yael, a former colonel in the IDF, and their two children, Achiad and Mika. And before we move forward, I need to ask you if you know Alon and Debbie Dumanis in Modi'in.
Nope.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Okay, he's a general in the Israeli Air Force. At the time that I knew him and married him to Debbie, who grew up at Beth-El, Debbie Herman, he was a colonel, but he is a retired member of the force. I would love for you to connect with Alon and Debbie Dumanis. And if you say hello.
Sounds great.
Remember me to them. Wonderful. Well, it's a unique opportunity to have you with us this morning, Dr. Hess, in light not only of present developments, but of historic developments in Israel. developments that not only impact on the life of Israeli citizenship, but most significantly in the relationship between Israel and the diaspora, and particularly in the relationship between Israel and the United States. So before we enter into conversation about current issues of substance for our conversation, I was hoping that you could take some time to give us a background regarding the state of religion in the state of Israel and how decisions made by the early founders of the state of Israel, what has come to be known as the status quo, impact the current reality. So if you would just kind of give us a background or that we can then know how the conversation can move.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Dvorah, and thank you, Rabbi, for the warm opening. I'm touched. It's a privilege to speak with you today. I'd like to relate to what you just asked from a personal perspective, with your permission. How I got involved with what I do today and with the tension between state and religion in Israel, and what is the history that brought us to this time. But you mentioned, Rabbi, that you studied in the Hebrew U in 1967. So 1967, that's the year when I was born. And I'm mentioning it because I was born to the greater Jerusalem. I had a wonderful childhood in one of the neighborhoods of Jerusalem. I was born to two caring parents in a Chiloni, secular, but I'm not sure it's secular is the right term. A Chiloni family in Israel. I went through the regular path of Yelet Tov Yerushalayim, of your average kid in Jerusalem. I was drafted to the army at the age of 18, like most Israelis. This is where I met my wife, Yael, and you mentioned, Rabbi, that she was just retired from the army as a colonel. We met in the army, we fell in love and got married. She stayed in the army and I left after 3 or 4 years and went to the Hebrew University, studied Hebrew literature. And then in the middle of my master's, went to fulfill my father's dream or thought that I will be a good lawyer. And I went to law school, graduated law school, and the year was 2000. And I sat with Yael, my wife, in Jerusalem in a coffee shop on Friday morning. You know, we don't work in Israel on Fridays. We do work on Sundays, but on Fridays we do not work. And we had a wonderful, breakfast in a coffee shop in the heart of Jerusalem. And we saw an ad in the paper, an ad of the Jewish agency that was looking for shlichim to go to North America and to work on behalf of the Jewish agency in the Jewish Federation, some Jewish federation. We didn't know exactly what is Shaliach, we didn't know what is Jewish Federation, but something called us, something kara lanu. In Hebrew we say kara, and kara has two meanings. With aleph, it's calling, and with hey, it's happened. So something kara lanu in both ways, I think, when we saw that ad. And we applied. And sooner than later, we had many exams and routines of making sure that you are eligible to go on that shlichut. And we found ourselves 8 months later in a small town in southern Arizona, a town named Tucson. And this is where we spent 3 wonderful years. Now, you mentioned that I am a 10th generation Jerusalemite, which is true. But something interesting happened to us when we came to your side of the ocean, to North America. For 3 years, we experienced a different kind of Judaism, a Judaism that we hardly knew when we were in Israel, and that we never felt that is authentic because we were not exposed to it. And a few weeks after we arrived, I was invited by one of the leaders of the Jewish Federation to a bat mitzvah of his granddaughter in a conservative Masoorki shul. Anshe Israel is the name of the congregation in Tucson. It's the biggest conservative shul in Tucson. And I remember quite vividly entering the sanctuary that Shabbat morning, seeing on the bima the bat mitzvah girl with her granddaughter, with her grandmother, and they were both with talitot, the grandmother and the bat mitzvah girl. And of course, there was the rabbi, and I remember how weird it felt to me, bringing my 10 generations memories of Jerusalem to that moment in a synagogue that felt very much like a synagogue, but with no mechitza. In Kriyat Torah, that felt very much like a wonderful Kriyat Torah, but women are on the bima and the bat mitzvah girl is reading that Torah. And I remember how in the beginning it felt weird, and how during the 3 years that we spent in Tucson, it became a second nature to me, and it became something that brought me to the feeling and to the obligation that I will not be going back to Israel practicing law, but will be working in the arena of Jewish peoplehood, which I did, and brought me to many thoughts about the unholy tension between state and religion in Israel that brought me to the age of 30-something, experiencing for the first time, not in Jerusalem, but in Tucson, my first significant and meaningful Shabbat. And this is a big, big question mark on the very existence of who we are as a country, the state of Israel. And that brings me, Rabbi, to the heart of your question, the tension between religion and state and how it all began. Now, I will criticize the state of Israel in this session, and please bear with me. It's not because I don't love dearly my country, and it's not because I'm not a Zionist. I'm a very rooted Zionist that loves my country, that enjoy living in Israel, that thinks that it's a privilege to live here. I even dream in Hebrew. Yet, I do think that some things need to be said, and it has to do with that connection that I'd like to elaborate for a few about. So before the state was declared, there was few committees that were sent to Palestine by the United Nations to examine the tension between Jews and Arabs. The last commission that was sent was in 1947, and it was United Nations Special Committee to Palestine, UNESCO. This is how it was called in the papers of that time. And that commission, the leaders of the Yishuv, the leaders of the Jewish population who lived in Israel, and I'm talking about David Ben-Gurion and his colleagues on the WZO, they understood that it's probably going to be a historic commission, a commission that might be calling for a partition plan in Palestine, meaning the beginning of the Jewish state. And David Ben-Gurion prepared himself quite intensively to that testimony in front of the commission. And he knew that it would be very important that his testimony to the commission will be highly respected by the members of that commission. And he knew that he might have a challenge here because, yes, he was the leader of the WZO. Yes, he was quite acceptable by the majority of the people the Jews who lived in Israel back then. And just to remind ourselves, we are talking about a Jewish population of 600,000 Jews. That's it. But yet he knew that there is a part of that population that would not accept his leadership. And in order, and I'm talking now about the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox and the other Orthodox that were part of the 600,000 people. And he wanted to give his testimony to that commission with the ability to say and to convince that he is the sole leader of the issue, that they can count on him, that he can deliver. And in order to do so, he was a politician. You know, he was a big statesman and a prophet, and I can tell you many, many good things about Ben-Gurion, but he was also a politician, and he knew that he needs to create consensus. He needs to convince the Orthodox to come to terms with the understanding that he is the leader, and he sent them a letter. He negotiated and then sent them the letter that you mentioned, Rabbi, the status quo letter. This letter exists in Israel's politics up until today. And David Ben-Gurion, even before the state was established, promised 4 things to the Orthodox community back then in Israel. The first one was something that I think was quite, it's a natural thing. He promised that the day of rest in the Jewish state would be Shabbat. You know, what else? Of course, it would be Shabbat. Who would thought it wouldn't be Shabbat? And I think on that, he was quite right. You know, it's who could think otherwise? But yet, when you think about it in a retrospect, from that to the understanding that there will not be public transportation in Shabbat in Israel, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the only interpretation that there could be. You know, people with no cars cannot enjoy public transportations. I'm not sure that that's the only interpretation that could have happened here. So the first was Shabbat, again, questionable. The second was Kashrut. They demanded that the regulation of Kashrut would be in the Orthodox interpretation of Kashrut. We are talking about the Jewish dietary laws of halakha, of the Jewish law. And I can understand why it's important for an army to have one standard of kashrut, because if you want Jews from all walks of life to eat together in one dining room, it's obvious that it has to be kosher, and it's obvious that it has to be more strict kosher for everyone that will be able to eat together. That I can understand, that I can respect. 70 years later, you look backwards and you see, wow, it created basically a monopoly of kashrut, of one set of kashrut that is only respected. This is the only kashrut that is respected, and in a monopoly that is run by one chief rabbinate. And we know that monopolies in each and every place and arena where they are the sole player create corruption. And it's quite known today that the kashrut monopoly in Israel is not only full with corruption, it's not necessarily keeping the kashrut as it should be in many, many places. So the second obstacle. The third one, the third thing that he promised in this status quo letter had to do with marriage and divorce. As you know, and if not, I'll mention it now, the only way to conduct a Jewish wedding in Israel that would be recognized by the state, it's only if it's an Orthodox wedding conducted by an Orthodox rabbi. It means that your rabbi cannot conduct a wedding in Israel that would be recognized. It means that if he does so, and if a conservative Masoorki rabbi in Israel would do so, or a Reform rabbi for that regard, he might be indicted. He might be taken to court and might be taken to sent to jail to up to 2 years. Big, big drama. Thank God it never happened, meaning no rabbi was sent to jail, but one of our rabbis, it was like 3 years ago, Rabbi Dubi Chayun, was arrested because of a wedding that he did. Now, this is from all aspects that I just, from the two aspects that I talked about the Shabbat and about the Kashrut. You know, I can talk about each one of them, why it's good, why it's bad. With marriage and divorce, it's a big drama that basically puts Israel in an awkward position. It means, and I say it heavy-heartedly, that Israel today is the only Western country in the world where Jews do not celebrate freedom of religion. The only democracy in the world where Jews cannot marry the way they want to marry Jewishly is the state of the Jews. It's a big shonda. It's a big. I think even a shame on our democracy. Lastly, in this letter was education. They demanded to have an autonomy over their children's education. Again, I can respect it. Parents should have some kind of veto over the way that they educate their children. Does it mean that we are doing good for the children if we are not enforcing that education system to have core curricula to study math and English and other things, science, humanities? Again, I'm not sure. But these four elements, to put it in, to summarize, are a part of the status quo letter. And I will summarize my answer here, Rabbi, that in each and every coalition agreement that was signed in the state of Israel ever since its establishment, the two words in Latin, status quo, had a place. And it basically meant that it's very hard in Israel to change the relationship between state and religion, although it's quite obvious and felt that this tension discriminates a good part of the Jewish people.
Well, thank you for that very comprehensive explanation of the situation. And that sets the stage for some of the details that we're going to be talking about. Before I pose further questions, I'd like to welcome my friends and colleagues from the Jewish Community Relations Council. I see Steve Clapper, past president, who's also an active member of our congregation, David Sklar, who is the Director of Government Affairs. What is your new title now? Assistant Executive Director, and the Executive Director herself, I think. I see Mint's family, but I presume that's Lindsay, who is the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. We're delighted that you're joining us for this important conversation. Dr. Hess, based on what you have described, give us some insights concerning the recent decision of the Israel Supreme Court to recognize conversions performed in Israel by the conservative and reform movements for purposes of the law of return. And you need to underscore that, of course. This has prompted, as we know, rather vitriolic responses from the Orthodox religious and political sectors in Israel. Very nasty terms used to describe reform and conservative Jews and their versions of Judaism, our versions of Judaism. Would you explain what's involved here and what is the raucous all about?
So firstly, it is a complicated issue. I'd like to try to simplify it as much as possible. From the first stages of Ben-Gurion as a leader, he was fascinated by a question that seems to be a very simple one. And we know, because we are all here sharing our love to the Jewish tradition, that it's complicated. The question is, who is a Jew? Not what is a Jew, but who is a Jew? What is a Jew? It's a philosophical question. Who is a Jew? It has also implication when it comes to a Jewish state that needs to decide whom would be eligible to get citizenship according to the law of return. The law of return means that whomever is a Jew, either that was born to a Jewish mother or that was converted, or that one of his grandmothers or grandfathers was Jewish, is eligible to get Israeli citizenship. Now, during the first decades of the state, it did not become a big issue. It was more of a philosophical one. But in the last 30 or 40 years, and I talk now in the beginning of the 80s especially, that question, because of political reasons of Israel, in Israel became very hectic and very a burning issue. How do you define a Jew? Now, the law didn't say if what kind of conversion would allow you to be a Jew that gets the eligibility of citizenship in Israel. And about 20 years ago, it was 19 years ago, in 2002, there was a Supreme Court decision that if you were converted outside of Israel in a known Jewish congregation, meaning a congregation of one of the three streams, Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox, and your conversion is recognized by your stream, you are eligible to make Aliyah. It made a big fuss back then, but the fuss, slowly went down, and we are working with these regulations up until today, meaning if you are converted outside of Israel by a known rabbi in a known congregation, you are eligible to make Aliyah if you want to do so. The big thing was about what happened in Israel, because you could do it if you were abroad, but if you are in Israel and you are not an Israeli citizen, for many, many years up until the ruling of last week, you could have not made a recognized conversion in Israel that would give you the eligibility to make Aliyah, although you're already in Israel, meaning to get Israeli citizenship. Now, it was a big time of, it was obvious that it needs to be fixed because it doesn't make sense that outside of Israel it would work, but inside in Israel, of Israel, it won't work. But the court and that petition that we submitted alongside with the reform movement was submitted 15 years ago, and the government dragged its feet for many, many years, asked for another extension and another extension, and said we are going to legislate it and didn't legislate. So basically the court didn't have much reasoning not to, at the end of 15 years, not to allow it. But from a legal point of view, it was interesting. And if there are some lawyers in this group, they would know how courts sometimes create their rulings. So the court had petitions from the three streams: Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, and each one of them wanted to get recognition for a private conversion, meaning not a conversion that was done by the chief rabbinate, but a conversion that was done outside of the chief rabbinate. And one of the cases was an Orthodox conversion that was done by a Haredi private Beit Din, by the Haredi court in Bnei Brak of Rabbi Karelitz. And 5 years ago, the Supreme Court decided to release a ruling that accepted Rabbi Karelitz's conversions because no one could say that it's not Jewish. And they built the construction of their ruling on in a very systematic way that basically allowed the court, the same court 5 years later, to release the ruling that they just released last week, and basically made it equal. Meaning all conversions of all streams, even if they are done in Israel, as long as they are recognized and accepted by one of the streams, will be accepted by the state of Israel as eligible for citizenship, Chok HaShvut. Now, you would say, what's the big deal? What's the fear? Is it only the fact that they don't want to give legitimization to the non-Orthodox streams in Israel? This is the only thing that they are fearful from. And I would like to say, quite frankly, that it's not necessarily the case. Yes, there is discrimination against Reform and Conservative Jews in Israel by the fact that the state does not recognize us equally. But they were afraid, and I think that some of the people who claim against this ruling are, I can identify that some of these claims are authentic, that they say, listen, the fear is that we will have immigrants, illegal immigrants coming from Africa, coming from Egypt, coming from Jordan, coming to Israel, applying for conversions in one of the non-Orthodox streams, and in 1 month they will be Jewish and they will be eligible for citizenship. Now, I'm not sure that it's a true fear, but it's at least something that we need to deal with when we are talking about the Israeli public, and we are dealing with it. Of course, it's not the case. And both movements, I would say also about our movement, of course, but also about the reform movement, that we are quite cautious that people that will be going through our conversion courses will not be doing so to exploit Israel's policy of citizenship to Jews. And, in years we'll be able to say if we were successful, but I'm quite confident that we will be. And this is another important stone that needs to be put on the wall that would create a better Israel. And when I say a better Israel, a more Jewish Israel and a more democratic Israel. A more democratic Israel and the more Jewish Israel, because this is the way and the reason why we founded this country to begin with.
Thank you. You made it clear, but let me reiterate that the legislation applies only to matters concerning the law of return or becoming citizens of the state of Israel. Still, if an individual so converted wishes to be married through the Israeli rabbinate, they would face issues of proving their Jewish authenticity, right?
Indeed.
So the issues of what is called ishut, identity, remain within the jurisdiction of the Orthodox. Well, in light of this conversation, the broader question is, these decisions and this lifestyle concern does not impact only on conservative and reform and reconstructionist, other progressive Jews in Israel, but on the Israeli secular public. How is the secular Israeli public, who don't regard themselves as Orthodox and don't identify with the liberal streams of Judaism? Tell us a little bit about that tension.
So, there is it was known for many, many years that there is a dichotomy between secular Jews in Israel, Chiglonim, and between religious Jews in Israel. The majority were Orthodox. And I think that in the last decade or decade and a half, significant things are changing. I think that more and more Israelis from the secular sector were exposed to the fact that there is more than one way to be Jewish. And we see by numbers in several statistics that were done in Israel that the number of secular people that define themselves only secular is going down, while the number of people that are identifying themselves with the non-Orthodox streams, conservative, Masoorki, and reform, is going up. If we were marginal up until 20 or 30 years ago, today about 7 to 8% of Jews in Israel would define themselves as either Reform or Masoorki conservative, about half and half. It means that more than 500,000 Israelis, 600,000 Israelis, were exposed to something that made them understand, A, that there is more than one way to be Jewish, and B, that they would like to identify themselves as one of the two streams. It's the beginning of a revolution. Maybe not a revolution, maybe evolution, because it won't be happening in one day, but it's a good evolution. Having said that, one thing that is a good test for the change is the number of weddings that are being done via the chief rabbinate. Today, there is a declining number of weddings, percentage-wise, that are being conducted by the chief rabbinate, meaning Jewish couples that would like to marry and are going to the only path that will be recognized, meaning to get an Orthodox wedding via the chief rabbinate. And today, 1 of 5 weddings in Israel in the Jewish sector are being done outside of the Jewish of the chief rabbinate in a creative way. One of the creative ways could be going to a Masoorki rabbi or to a Reform rabbi. Other creative ways would be a secular Jewish wedding, meaning with a heavy a Jewish component, but without the coercion of the chief rabbinate. And one would say, what's the big deal going via the chief rabbinate? And I will touch on that for a second, but I would like to stop for a moment to say there are changes in the civil society that happen because from bottom up it raises. And I think that what happened in the last decade and a half with weddings in Israel gives me a sense of optimism, because it means that many people in Israel simply get it, that they should take ownership on their Jewish identity, should take ownership on their Jewish faith and the way that they are making, creating families, Jewish families, in a way that would not be affected by the monopoly of the chief rabbinate that might be, I would say very mildly, not so pleasant, especially for women. If, God forbid, you are getting divorced and the Beth Din that will discuss your case is a Beth Din of 3 Orthodox rabbis, that their interpretation of the Jewish law, and I'm not looking down on their interpretation, don't get me wrong, I'm not looking down on it, but their interpretation of the Jewish law was frozen 300 years ago because of reasons that we can justify and that we can respect, but still, when you are the soul that is standing in this court, you want to be equal to the man that you are divorcing from, and according to that interpretation of halakha, you are not equal. And this is something that touches the very essence of who you are as a citizen in a democratic country. And this is enough reason to change it, but it's a good reason for us to tell the story that there are more ways of interpreting halakha. And I'm so proud of the way that we, the Masoorki Jews, Masoorki Judaism, interpreting halakha with a strong commitment to our tradition, and as well as strong commitment to the changes that needs to happen when they are needed. And this golden path is not necessarily something that we feel easily in Israel in each and every case of the chief rabbinate when they are dealing with things.
Thank you. For a while, there were, I don't know if this is still the case, but many Israeli couples who would choose to go outside of the state to get married and then come back. A lot went to Crete, to neighboring countries, would get married, and then their marriage would be recognized civilly. It might still have some problems with religious recognition. And I know of experiences of my progressive liberal colleagues in Israel, Reform and Conservative, who have officiated at weddings with a cooperative Orthodox rabbi signing the papers, but the non-Orthodox rabbi doing the ceremony.
Yeah. So today we do not encourage both things. A, we do not encourage couples to marry outside of Israel and coming to Israel, because it's absurd, and because according to the Israeli law, if God forbid they get divorced, they need to go first via the rabbinical court, because they are registered as married. And it might, they try to avoid the rabbinical court in its Orthodox setting, and they are being taken there. But you are right that it's funny. You could be married by Elvis Presley in Las Vegas, in the lobby of whatever hotel, because in Nevada it's very easy to get married, and that Elvis Presley signed document will be respected in Israel, and you will be considered as married, while you, Rabbi, your wedding in Israel will not be recognized. But that's the opposite. So we don't encourage going abroad, and by the same reason, I know that some of your colleagues used in the past, and even today, friends that are Orthodox rabbis to be attending and signing the papers, and to have another fashion of a chatuna, of a wedding. But from the same reasons, if it doesn't solve the couple's problem, if God forbid they need to divorce, it is not recommended. And today, although civil marriages are not recognized in Israel, there is kind of a common law marriage that doesn't call marriage, it calls tudat zugiyut, that is being given, but some places even by municipalities, that it doesn't give you all the rights of a married couple, but it gives you, I would say, 98% of all rights. So 2% is still big, especially if you are in those 2%. And one of these issues has to do with you guys, meaning the ability to get visas to the United States of America. If the man or the wife in one of the sides of the couple is applying for a work visa because of relocation or something, and they are not married by the state, they might be rejected. So this is one of the issues. But again, it's 98% of the issues are solved on that. So we do not recommend going to via the regular path. But it is insulting, the fact that your country would not register you as married, even though you married Kedat Moshe Israel, like your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather. And in the Jewish state, they will say, no, it only has to go via one way. Frustrating, indeed.
Thank you. Let me ask you to comment a little bit, because you began to touch on women's issues, and this is related to that. Could you tell us a little bit about the egalitarian prayer space at the wall, how issues are unfolding there, and how that impinges on other concerns of egalitarian and women's rights? And then if you would make a comment also on the Israeli Reform Rabbi Gilad Kariv, who is running for a Knesset position, and how that is being perceived.
So let me start with that. I'm really thrilled that my colleague for many years, when I was the executive director of the Masoorki movement, remind me that I need to talk about my current position as well in the Zionist movement. But for many years, I was the executive director of the Masoorki movement, and my colleague, Gilad Kariv, a Reform rabbi, a very talented person, knowledgeable, was just successful in the Labor Party primaries, and he's number 4 on the list of the Labor. And it's likely, very likely, that he will be a Knesset member in the coming Knesset. It's the first time that a Reform rabbi will be at the Knesset. There are many Orthodox rabbis at the Knesset. It will be the first time for a Reform rabbi to be there. And it's historical, not only because it's the first time, but also because for many, many years, we, both of us, were invited to Knesset committees to speak on different issues on state and religion. And whenever we spoke, Rabbi Kariv or myself, the Haredi Knesset members would have stood up and leave the room. You start talking, and they would like to show their disrespect, and they stand up and simply leave the room as if as if you are air. And now, when he becomes a Knesset member, they won't be able to do it anymore. And if they try, they would lose the vote. So it's good that historically that he's there, and I hope that he will do good. I'm sure that he will. Now, Gilad and myself, as well as the leadership of Women of the Wall, were very much involved in the negotiations of the Western Wall, the Kotel. For 4 intense years, we were negotiating to find a solution to one of the hectic boiling tensions in the city of Jerusalem around a place that should have been a place of unity. In 1967, Jews returned to the Wailing Wall, to the Kotel, after many years that we could not pray there. And slowly but surely, it became a place that Jews from all over the world were able to visit again. Of course, Jews in Israel, but from all over the world. And it created a good vibe within non-Orthodox movements also outside of the state of Israel. Conservative Judaism was Zionist from day one. Reform Judaism wasn't Zionist from day one, but they joined Zionism after 1967. And one of the reasons was, it seems like history is going on the right way, and Jews again could pray next to the wall. Unfortunately, the wall in the last 50-something years, the Kotel, became slowly but surely an Orthodox synagogue, and where Jews that are not practicing Judaism in an Orthodox way felt less and less welcome. And one of the things that are not that we cannot do at the Kotel these days is praying in our minhag, meaning davening with no mechitza, men and women together. And for many, many years, it created a big tension. The pioneers on that are Women of the Wall, although their minhag is not to pray men and women together, but women minyan in the women's section. Still, it did not work. I'm proud that the Masoorki movement was one of its leaders of this battle. I'm not sure if you were there, but in 1971, Rabbi, RA convention was held in Israel, and they davened in the Kotel, and there is a headline in the VAR. It's one of the weeklies back then the headline was conservative egalitarian prayer at the wall. Many years since then, and there was battle and there was violence, and we were sacked out of there, and we were chased by the police or by the Orthodox governors. At the end, after 4 years of negotiations, we were able to create a new paradigm, a paradigm that I defended for ever since then. I'm not sure that I will defend it anymore, but it was basically understanding that no one would win and that we would need to split, meaning that we would take the Kotel and divide it to 2. The known side of the Kotel would have a minhag makom of orthodoxy, and the other side of the Kotel, that less known place of the Kotel, a place, an archaeological site named Robinson Arch, would be the egalitarian part of the Kotel. We didn't sign this agreement gladly. We thought that it's a big sacrifice. We had some demands that were respected, and still we thought that we are not the winners of this compromise, but Jerusalem is winning a good compromise, and therefore we are for it. The government of Israel, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, approved this agreement in January 31st, 2016. And unfortunately, 6 months later, the same government with the same prime minister tabled the agreement, and it was never implemented. It means that up until today, the discrimination in the Kotel is felt each and every day. It means that our side of the Kotel does not look like in the festivity it should have looked. It's not taken care of. It doesn't have the ruling construction that we built in this compromise. And it's one of the open wounds, I think, that are there in the tensions between Jews who live in Israel and Jews who live outside of Israel. It created even a rift between our two communities. And I look forward to the next government, hopefully to be elected and convened in the next few months after the elections that we have later this month. And one of the things that I look for that government and would demand from that government is the implementation of the Kotel Agreement that unfortunately is simply frozen and still being deliberated in court.
Yeah, well, thank you. The issue is persistent, and I remember taking a congregational trip to Israel in the early 80s, and on Shabbat evening we walked to the wall, and we stood way on the other side of the fence that designates the praying section, and we gathered in a circle of about perhaps a minyan, 10 people, and we started chanting some songs of Kabbalat Shabbat, and there were Orthodox Jews that came and shooed us away. Whether or not they were representatives of the Kotel rabbinate or not, but that was not acceptable. I know that our own federation and JCRC has taken Atid groups to Israel, our young leadership, and I have a wonderful picture of my daughter, part of one of those groups, with tefillin, praying at the Robinson's Arch side of the wall. It wouldn't make representatives of the Orthodox rabbinate too happy, but it makes me very proud. So I want to pause, and perhaps people in our Zoom have some questions that they would like to ask you. I have a lot of other questions, but if there are any particular concerns, just raise your hand and I would be pleased to recognize you. You can pose your question or write something into the chat. Well, until I see any questions or any interest in asking, let me ask you this. How can we as American Jews serve as allies of non-Orthodox religious movements in Israel, best serve the interests of a pluralistic, egalitarian, and democratic Judaism in the state of Israel?
So that's a very important question, and I would like to address this as candid as I can. The main obstacle, really the main obstacle of the non-Orthodox movements in Israel and Masoorki movement especially, is not necessarily the legal status, but the discrimination when it comes to funding. In Israel, there is no separation of religion and state. And it's not necessarily bad, I must tell you. There are many democracies where there is no separation of religion and state. But in Israel, it's a unique phenomenon because only one stream of Judaism is being funded by the government. So if religion is funded in your country, but only one stream of religion is funded, it means that the discrimination is so high because we do not have, I'm talking now about Masoorki Jews in Israel, we don't have the ability to tell our story, to share the narrative that there is more than one way to be Jewish. When your clergy that in the Orthodoxy is being paid by the government needs to be paid by us, by you, this is something that in the long run, that in the strategic way of looking at things, it's an obstacle that is bigger and more dramatic than any other obstacle. So if you ask me what can be done, so yes, I think that when you think about your charity and when you think about where to give and how to give, and if you give to Israel, it's good, it's important, make sure that you invest your dollars in places that promote Jewish pluralism. And in our case, in the Masoorki movement in Israel, in our ability to have rabbis working in Israel, this is very, very, very important. And this is why the Masoorki Foundation is working. Secondly, it's the political aspect. And on that, I would like to talk about two dimensions when it comes to politics. The first one is when elected officials are coming to visit you in your side of the ocean. In Corona days, no one is traveling, but soon enough, or sooner than later, I hope, we'll be back into a normal life sometime. And the Israeli politicians will be flying as lecturers to federations and to other places. Make sure that when they address your Jewish federation or your Jewish synagogue, whatever they come to, that they hear vocally and strongly and in an Israeli way that the discrimination against non-Orthodox Jews cannot be tolerated anymore. But politically, something that you can do other than talking against or trying to deliver a message to an Israeli politician is to be part of our political system. And fortunately, it can be done every 5 years via the national institutions. I'm serving now as the vice chairman of the World Zionist Organization. I was elected in the Zionist Congress to this position by your votes. I'm the political representative of Merkaz. Merkaz is the political arm of the Masoorki conservative Judaism in the national institutions. And I guess if not all of you, at least some of you voted to the Congress a few months ago, and it allowed us to get influence within the national institutions. Now, the national institutions were created way before the state of Israel was declared. It was established by Herzl. And these institutions are working and functioning and allocating funds in a round table where Jews from all streams and all places in the world are represented. Now, this is a place that I must tell you that we didn't use good enough for many years. And I'd like to hope that via the discourse that we are now having and the discourse that will be done in the next few years, we will create a vibrant kind of will that would make people understand that their ability to take part in the Zionist movement is something that in their own hands. And it's very easy in North America more than other places, more in Europe. Meaning just understanding that you can be Zionist, you can support the Zionist endeavor, and you can support it in a liberal, democratic, humanistic way to make sure that there is Israel that you can relate to, an Israel that you can love, in spite of the fact that the state of Israel's government is not necessarily doing always the right things, and I'm talking mildly, and you can do it by participating in the elections in the Zionist movement. So it's kind of long answer to a short question, Rabbi, but it has to do with money and with political influence, and both things can be achieved.
Yeah, thank you. The relationship has to be reciprocal and ongoing. You began by talking about your experience in Tucson, going to the synagogue and being exposed. One of the things that I have always made a point of is when we have new shlichim in Indianapolis to introduce them to and to make sure that they get exposed to the synagogue experience and not just to the community experience. And I talk to my leadership, I talk to my federation leadership, some of whom are here today. I think part of the job description of a shaliach and a representative of the educational representatives, whether they come to work for the community center or the federation or whatever, is that they should be exposed to and learn about the nature of American Judaism, not just be deliverers, but also recipients of the experience.
You are so right on that. I saw many times when federations, JCRCs, other commissions are bringing lectures from Israel, not politicians, lectures from Israel about high tech and whatever. They get to lecture to the Jewish community in some gathering, but you guys never insist that they will be part of your life as well. Make sure that on Shabbat, on Kabbalat Shabbat, they go to shul. Just, even if they came to speak about high tech, make sure that there is a family that takes them to shul. For some of them, it would be the first time in a non-Orthodox shul. And it's an experience that every Jew should have, even if he or she is not religious. And this is an educational tool that you have in your hands. Use it. It's the best tool that could be, I think.
Yes, thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, and I was wondering if you would say a word about the status of non-Jewish religious communities in Israel and what we in the United States call interfaith relationships, right? Jews and non-Jews getting together, learning from one another, talking, Muslims, Christians, and that's an important issue that concerns us because that's an important issue in the United States.
So 20% of the population in Israel are not Jews, either Christians or Muslims. The majority are Muslims. And usually when you talk about minorities in a democracy, it's a simple question because it's obvious that equal rights should be in place and everyone should get what he or she needs to get. And it's something that needs to be fixed if indeed there is no equality. Now in Israel, it's slightly more complicated, because there is no equality. I must tell you that the minorities in Israel are not necessarily treated in the same way that we all want them to be treated, as far as infrastructure and otherwise. Having said that, yes, they can vote. It's very open. And this is something that no one is discriminated by. And you need to add to that equation the simple fact that there is an ongoing existential tension, threat, security challenges that are with the Arab populations outside of the state of Israel. So it means that each and every attempt to narrow the gaps between the minority and the majority in the civil democratic necessity, what things that needs to be done are always in the back of your head. You need to remember that is also this security challenge that is influenced by the fact that we did not achieve peace yet with our neighbors, or at least the majority of our neighbors. As far as religious rights, I think that they are in better shape than Reform and conservative Jews in Israel, because here there is no monopoly. There are several segments of Christianity that are recognized by the state, and there are several streams of Islam that are recognized by the state. So when it comes to that issue, I think that they are better treated than us on that regard. But in many other aspects, I don't want to make the picture too rosy. It is a challenge that definitely needs to be addressed, a challenge that I hope that we will be able to solve. And these coming elections in March 23rd, we will have elections in Israel. It's very bad for the country to have 4 rounds of elections in 2 years. But one thing that happened for the good is declarations, not from the usual suspects, and I'm talking now about leaders of the right wing and leaders of the left wing, Bibi Netanyahu from right side and Yair Lapid and others from the center left side, that enough already with the veto over, enough already with the taboo over taking the Arab parties into the coalition. It was never that an Arab party was part of the coalition, because they didn't want, because the coalition didn't want. I think that we are now mature enough as a country, as a democracy, to accept an Arab party as a true member of a given coalition. I think that if it happens, it would break a wall of hatred that needs to be broken. And because of various reasons, of political necessities of both sides, right and left, it might be that the next coalition will have and are a party officially a member of. It would be a bright day in Israel's democracy, and I look forward to it.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. We have been informed, and I know that we have been inspired as well. I would love to have you back sometime where perhaps we can invite an interfaith constituency to talk about issues. And one of the topics that I would have liked to develop today, but which would probably take an hour by itself, is the political component of the interfaith dialogue in the United States and in Israel, and the role of evangelical Christian communities in this country in impacting both religion and politics in the state of Israel. But we'll save that for another visit, and I hope you will be agreeable to joining us again in the not too distant future.
Gladly, I'll do it.
Great. Well, let me thank you all. This program is a new effort on the part of our adult education outreach. I hope that I will see many of you for the conversation next week, when I'm going to be talking with Evan Lubline, who is the executive director of Hooverwood. We're going to be talking about nursing home care issues during the pandemic and how Hooverwood exemplifies a model of care. And then the week after that, we're going to be getting ready for Pesach, and we're going to be talking about preparations surrounding the observance of the Seder and Passover. The second cycle around during the pandemic, hopefully under a bit more permissible conditions than we experienced the first Pesach around. And with a note of hope for the medical condition which we face, and for the political and spiritual and humanitarian developments that are still ours to address, I'd like to thank you all, and particularly Dr. Hess and Devorah Greenberg for joining us this morning. Shavua Tov, everybody.
Shavua Tov.
Yeah.
Thank you.